we haven't got Mick here, who is the expert here, but I wondered if we could just start off, if you give us a little bit of an idea of the inspiration for this book. I mean, when we look in the inside, we have that sort of very telling second introduction, how to succeed in the music industry without being part of the mainstream. I think that's obviously really important in a key way. So, just tell us a little bit about how this came about.
Right, so, I mean, very flatteringly, I have been asked a few times over the last few years if I wanted to do a book. And my knee-jerk reaction was always, it would be a very boring book, because essentially it's a story of a music nerd that fell in love with music and dedicated their life to making records. And I say that, I don't say that lightly. When I say I'm making records, that's really what I fell in love with. Not the idea of being a guitar player, not the idea of being on stage, not the idea of being, out on tour, being a rock and roll star. I fell in love with making these, what at the time were these sort of 12-inch plastic things in gatefold sleeves. I loved that idea and I fell in love with that. So I thought, well, it'd be a very boring book. And then about 2.5 years ago, just before lockdown, I had lunch with Mick. And Mick was another of those guys that was kind of pushing me, you should do a book, you should do a book. And he kind of persuaded me, as someone that's written a lot of rock biographies, that what I was imagining people wanted, that story about the rock and roll band that forms in a basement and then has a big hit single, goes on top of the pops, goes on the road, groupies, religion, drugs, and all the fallout from that. He persuaded me that actually people are bored with that story because they've read it so many times. And actually there are thousands of books that kind of chart that trajectory. And he's written a lot of them himself. So he was saying, what would be interesting is for you to write a book that kind of gives the other side of the story, which is someone that just dedicates themselves to making music, quality music. And the more I kind of thought about it, the more I thought, well, I am in this very strange position where I have, I think by most people's standards, a reasonably successful career being a professional musician without ever having really popped my head into the mainstream. So, most of the people, and I'm sure the people here too that know me, most of the people that have discovered my music have done so in a very kind of organic way. Usually a friend has introduced them to the music, or, it's that personal touch, sort of people telling other people. And that in itself, I think, is, and here he is, Mick Wall. I was just explaining the basic background. Hello, Mick. I was just explaining the sort of genesis, the provenance of the book, and this idea that writing a book that was kind of an alternative to the traditional rock and roll story, which you've written it yourself many, many times. And so we decided, myself and Mick, that was potentially an interesting story in itself. How do you succeed in the music industry without ever having been a part of what people traditionally think of as the infrastructure of mainstream pop culture? So, and then lockdown came along and there was no excuse not to write it.
It's true. I mean, I think Stephen's being a bit modest here as well. You may have already explained this, but he resisted the idea of doing a book for many, many years. As you can imagine, lots of people came to him. The first people that ever mentioned it to me was 2010. So that's how far back this idea went. But it was Stephen that insisted if he was going to do it, it wouldn't be once upon a time and then this happened and then that happened. And so we looked at other books as well to look for kind of different approaches.
You started
sending
me books, and a couple that you sent me early on I think became kind of touchstones for us. The firstly, the Ian Hunter Diary of a Rock and Roll Star, and also the Bob Dylan Chronicles book, which I don't know if any of you guys have read the Bob Dylan book, but it's far from a conventional autobiography. He literally just takes 4 or 5 snapshots from his life and kind of just examines those moments in almost forensic detail. And I found that really inspiring because it wasn't the traditional, I was born in 1942, my mother was a quantity surveyor, and it wasn't that. And so I think that kind of encouraged us, well, I was kind of set on it anyway, to not do the kind of linear autobiographical thing, but in fact to create a book where each of the chapters was almost modular, so you could just dip into it. And you can read the chapter about my relationship with my fans, or you can read the chapter about, I don't know, what else have we written about? You know, the list chapters and the books, the chapter about record shops. And you can kind of dip in, and each of those kind of has a standalone aspect to it, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. And part of the challenge for me was to find interesting ways to get Stephen to touch on some of these areas.
Find interesting ways for a very boring person.
Yeah. No, not at all. No. We started out with a lot of don'ts. You know, we're not going to do a big thing about porcupine tree. We're not going to do a big thing about your life, because he kept telling me how boring it was. But in fact, we did do some very nice stuff about the porcupine tree years. A lot of stuff I had no idea about. I didn't realise to what extent it had begun as you with a school friend in a bedroom inventing a group, which many of us did in little red exercise books. Or the whole chapter about New York and about how many times you're told you're going to become the new Pink Floyd, have a guitar-shaped swimming pool. Yeah. All of which you can imagine really fits with Stephen's approach, but also the autobiographical stuff. I was really intrigued to learn about your family, and some, like all families, populated by some very unexpected and unusual figures.
I think that was the surprise to me, that when I started to actually work on the book, it wasn't as boring as I thought it was going to be, because I started to, you know, look into my family history, and I did have my mother's brother kind of starved himself to death, and my godmother hung herself, and I'm like, fuck, wow. And I knew all that, I kind of knew all this stuff, but actually writing it down, I'm like, oh, okay, this isn't boring at all. This is really twisted, fucked up, and you know. And I started to understand the relationship between a lot of that. You know, I mean, that the classic thing is that my mum's brother Leonard did starve himself to death. He was a very lonely, isolated man, and I'd never made the connection between that and the A Hand Cannot Erase album, which is about a woman who essentially dies in her apartment and is not found for 2 years. And I'd not made that connection until I started to delve back into my history, and I'm like, okay, of course, that's why these stories are interesting to me. Not in a conscious way, but of course I'm attracted to those kind of stories because they are in my history, and they're in my past, and they're in my autobiography in that sense. And that was fascinating. And you know, I say at one point in the book that in some ways, writing the book is a way for me to try and understand myself, why I am what I am, and why I do what I do, and why I do it the way I do it. And I'm not sure I'm any closer to understanding that in a way, but it was very interesting to process all of that stuff and start to make those connections.
Yeah, it was also, from my perspective, unlike any other book I'd ever done where I'd worked with an artist, which nearly always is interviewing the artist and then on my own turning it into the words as though they had written them, based on what they've said. This was truly collaborative. We would take the transcripts of our conversations, and I would do a very loose edit, get rid of the ums and ahs and the repetitions, and give it to Stephen, and he would run with it, and we would kind of send it back and forth over various drafts until we felt that was the work. So Stephen really did write this book. It really is Stephen's book. And I don't expect I'll ever work on a book like it again. So be assured, this is Stephen sitting there writing a book, which you are now going to read. And had you ever done anything like that before?
I mean, obviously, you know, I've written things before. I wrote some short stories for one of my albums a few years ago. Got some ghost stories. I've always written, you know, I've always been attracted by, you know, the written word. I read a lot when I was a kid, not so much now, unfortunately. The speed of life means I don't get the chance to read as much as I used to, but I've always loved this idea of crystallizing a thought or an emotion or a moment in a series of words. And, you know, without wishing to state the obvious, it's really hard writing because there are an infinite number of permutations of a number of words. And it's like, you know, in a way, I love that idea of refining. Just even a single sentence, refining it so that it somehow crystallizes a thought perfectly. And you know, obviously, without wishing to state the obvious, that's what you do in lyrics as well, you know. So in a sense, this interest I've always had in the written word, this is a natural extension of that. And it's no coincidence that the book ends with to me, the book ends with a short story, which I feel, I mean, somebody asked me the other day, why did you put a short story in your book? I said, because that short story, in a way, tells you as much about me as everything that precedes it. Everything that precedes it. It tells you about my obsessions, my inner thoughts, my inner demons, the things that interest me, in a kind of fictional sense. But there's a lot of me, obviously, there's a lot of me in that story.
There's, I was also curious to, move that.
Feel free to dismantle them.
Can everybody see?
Hang on.
I'll leave that one there. I was also very curious to learn about Stephen's musical influences and references. I had not expected to learn about The Laughing No, nor ABBA, nor your vast collection of weird vinyl with strange covers. That Christmas. Tell us more about your love of The Laughing No and strange album covers.
Okay, so I think one of the things that I wanted to put to rest in the book, in a way, is the phenomena which you have with a lot of music journalism. And I'm having this now because we started now doing some interviews for the forthcoming Porcupine Tree record, and a lot of music journalism tends to be, I'm afraid to say, quite lazy. What's your favourite albums of all time? And I think part of that is that modern music is not interesting enough, so people tend to focus on the past. And so a lot of times you get, in interviews, you don't get asked about what you're doing, about your new record, you get asked about the influences behind it, or what are your favourite records, or what your favourite, you know, whatever it is, and favourite songs, favourite album covers. And I'm doing a lot of those interviews all the time. It seems to me like 50% of journalism seems to be about that now. Which is sad in a way, because it means that the new music, the new work is not interesting enough to talk about. So what I thought, it's one thing we could do with this book, if you remember right, when we talked about it at the beginning, was let's just, for once and for all, let's just put a list of my 100 favourite songs, so that anybody asks me in future, I can just say, it's in the book, just read the book, you know. But of course it hasn't made any difference at all. Only yesterday I was doing an interview with the German magazine, and they were saying, you pick your 10 favourite albums and talk about them. Really? So I kind of almost willfully over the years started to enjoy the process of blowing people's minds, because normally when they ask you that, it's better to Sergeant Pepper, Dark Side of the Moon, Who's Next, What's Going On, all the same albums that everyone else picks. And actually I thought to myself, well, those aren't the albums that mean the most to me. I mean, they're amazing, of course they are. You know, Dark Side of the Moon, as I write about in the book, was a very important album to me when I heard it as a kid. My dad used to listen to it all the time. But it's not one of my favourite albums. I don't need to ever hear it again. My favourite albums, the ones I find myself going back to time and time again, are perverse in a way. The Christmas album that my parents brought into the house in 1972, whenever it was, is still the album that I probably would save from a burning house, metaphorically speaking, because it's one that's completely bound up with nostalgic feelings about childhood. And it is, in a way, more dear to me than any of those canonical classic albums. And I kind of ran with that. So, you know, when I really think honestly about it, my list of favourite songs or favourite albums isn't a cool list. It's not a hipster's list. It's a list of the things that are really important to me. The first single I ever bought, Carly Simon's Nobody Does It Better, the theme to The Spy Who Loved Me, the Bond film of 1970, which my dad took me to. Again, these things are so precious to me because they are bound up with moments in my life and history. And very often those are not the canonical cool records. ABBA, I mean, ABBA was ubiquitous in my childhood, as I'm sure it was in yours. And And it's very hip these days to say ABBA are cool and you always listen to them. But I remember for a time, particularly in the 90s, that ABBA were beyond the pale. They were the sort of artists that you buy a cheap compilation from a service station, sort of hide it in the glove compartment when you're giving people a lift. Now, of course, there's nothing cooler than saying, yeah, ABBA, amazing pop. I've been saying it for years, just saying. I've been saying it and I have been unapologetic. And again, we talk about this in the book, that I don't believe in the notion of a guilty pleasure. I do not believe in that. And my love of The Laughing Gnome, which is the first single I ever owned or ever remember owning, which is ironically the coolest artist of all time, David Bowie, fact, and his uncoolest song that he ever recorded. And my love of it is completely ironic. I absolutely adore it. And even to the point that The Laughing Gnome is interesting because it has some what you might call studio trickery going on in it. His voice is speeded up. And I can say, okay, at the age of 5 or 6, whenever I first owned that single, that was in a way a doorway to this idea of using the studio in a kind of sound design way, doing things that you couldn't do on stage, processing, altering, using studio trickery to expand your palette. It's in that record. It's in that first single I ever owned, The Laughing Gnome, David Bowie doing an impression of a gnome, so like a munchkin. And and I can draw a line, and we do that in the book. I can draw a line between that and my fascination with people like Karl Stockhausen and serious 20th century avant-garde music, experimental music. It all starts with things like Dark Side of the Moon and The Laughing Gnome, and hearing these amazing records that had nothing to do with what you can or cannot do in the real world. It was about using the studio to alter sound in a kind of abstract way, electronic way in that sense.
It's interesting as well, I think, in the book, a theme you return to a lot. I don't know if you're aware, but this idea of really pushing against the idea of being pigeonholed, the king of prog.
I am aware, yeah.
I mean, you are the king of prog, we know that, but you don't, that's not who you see yourself as.
I am aware of that. In fact, one of my concerns with the book is that it reads too much like I've got a chip on my shoulder about that very thing. And I was conscious of that, and I think we talked about that towards the end of the book. Is there too much of this? Methinks he does protest too much, But I do talk about that because it's true. And this idea, I mean, I think at one point I also talk about the fact that Porcupine Tree in a way came to define me because it was the most successful thing I did. And even in my solo career, the two most successful albums have been the two that have been, that kind of sail closest to the idea of old-fashioned tropes of conceptual rock music, which are Raven and Hand Cannot Erase. And the other 4, which have very little to do, actually that's not true, but there's no one that does, but certainly 3 of them are much less close to that. And they haven't been as fated. So it's this theme in my life, which is the closer I go to progressive rock tropes, the more successful I seem to be. And that, in a sense, has come to define me. And I talk about how this idea that if my work as bass communion had been picked up by the world of cinema, or my early experiments with No Man in kind of synth pop and trip hop had been successful, then maybe those things would have defined me. But as it is, it's the progressive stuff, and also that obviously led to other doors opening to remix some of these classic progressive rock acts, which further cemented my. And I'm not trying to disown that side of my career. I'm very, very proud of that. But at the same time, it is reductive in the way that almost, and again, we talk about this in the book, every artist, there is a reductive version of that. We talk about the Bowie thing. For many people, David Bowie is lightning flash across the face, Ziggy Stardust. That's all they know about him.
Yeah.
And it's almost reduced to that. For many people on Spotify now, The Who is Won't Get Fooled Again, or whatever the theme music to NCIS is. I can't remember what it is. Who Are You?
CSI?
Yeah, CSI, yeah.
3 or 4 of them.
CSI, yeah. For many people, The Police is just Every Breath You Take and Roxanne. And that idea that every artist ultimately gets reduced down to a sort of single reductive, sort of version of themselves. And I have that too. And my version of that is I'm the king of prog. Even though it's a very, very small part of what I'm interested in and what I've done. And so there is a fair bit of that in the book.
Do you think the King of Prog faction will be disappointed with the book or baffled by the book, or do you think it might actually help them move more towards who you really are?
I would hope by now that even the people that are the progressive rock diehards will realise that's not me. Certainly after the last couple of albums, I think those people have drifted away anyway, or maybe not. And I think the people that are more open-minded that have come with me on the journey, they must surely know by now. That's the way I always feel. I'm always disappointed to be confronted sometimes with with the reductive version of myself. But it's usually, I don't think it's the fans, I think it's usually actually the media that have this reductive idea of me now. So again, if I'm approached by, one of the rare occasions when I am approached by someone in the mainstream, whether it's the BBC or whoever, one of the mainstream magazines, it's usually the King of Prog usually appears in the headline or the byline. I mean, Mojo just did a piece and it's the same thing again. And so I think that tends to come now more from the media. The sort of Grace Notes version of who I am comes from the media rather than from the I call them fans. I mean, fans seems like a very patronising way to describe the people that listen to my music. The people that listen to my music, I think, understand. Certainly, the ones that have stuck with me, they understand a lot about who I am now, and I think this book won't be a surprise to those people. And there will be things that will surprise them in it, but the general tenor of it, I don't think will surprise them.
So, having done this book, has it, and after years and years of saying, no, that's just not really something that interests you, can you see yourself doing other books? I mean, obviously, you're a short story writer, you're a lyric writer, but I mean, there are parts of your story that on their own could be books, not least Porcupine Tree. But on any subject, could you see yourself doing more books?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's fair to say this book would not have happened if it hadn't been for lockdown, or if it was going to happen, it would have taken us another 10 years. So obviously lockdown was a very peculiar set of circumstances, a perfect storm in a way. I mean, literally, we had our meeting about doing the book, I think just a few weeks before lockdown kicked in.
It was January 2020,
yeah.
And in March we were in lockdown, yeah.
And we were both saying to each other, well,
we're
busy, but we'll get back to it sometime. And then, of course, a couple of months later, we're writing to each other and saying, fuck, everything's just been cancelled, should we do this book? So I don't know if and I did find it hard, I don't mean that in a negative way, I found it harder than I thought it was going to be to write, because again, coming back to the idea, there are a million ways to put a few words on the page. And because I'm a perfectionist and I love the written word and I love the way it can be perfected and honed, it took a long time to get it exactly the way I want. In a way, I'm not sure if I would rather make a record than write another book. Probably I would make the records rather than write another book. But if the right idea came along, I would. Obviously there's a vanity and a conceit, and also being a published writer, which I love about this. So let's see what people make of it. Let's see what people.
Have you had much feedback yet about the book?
No, but it's a funny thing. I was saying to Andreas, my publisher, Little Brown, earlier. It's like with a record, the day it comes out, people have already listened to it and they kind of, what people think of it in a way. With a book, it takes 2, 3, 4 weeks for people to read it. So I think it's going to take some time before I actually understand what people make of the book. I'm curious. I mean, part of me is very uncomfortable about some of the stuff I've put in the book in a good way. I mean, uncomfortable about sharing some of these, because I think I have a reputation for being quite a private person. And I am a very private person, generally speaking. I don't see what a lot of that has to do with the work. So in a way, I've gone against that in this book by doing the very opposite of that. And I've been very personal. And I feel slightly uncomfortable about that. But I'm also very proud of the way that we've made the book. It's not something I would imagine myself wanting to do again, but as I say, maybe something in more fictional realm could be interesting, or a tour diary or something. Maybe a tour diary of the Porcupine Tree tour or something, because that's going to be interesting. I mean, that's like
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean that's going to be like an interesting thing.
I think that's a good idea, don't you?
Yeah, it might also be very boring.
I think you said that last time.
I said that last time, yeah. Because it is. I mean, I although we're not completely ruling out, I suspect it probably is the last time we will ever do some touring together. So it'll be interesting to document that process in a way. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the right kind of concept could be interesting.
Have you? We should probably speak a little bit as well about the special edition. So tell us a little bit more about that.
So the special edition is basically there's a supplemental book of a lot of the stuff that we felt was. I mean, I think the idea with this, I'm sure you'll agree with me, Mick. The idea with this was to try and write a book. Try and make a book which would have a universality about it. So you didn't have to be someone that knew who I was to at least find some of the chapters engaging. So that was very much our focus on the book itself, but we also had ideas for chapters which would be more fan related. So you did a fantastic thing. You took the early imaginary history of Porcupine Tree that was published in one of the very early cassettes, which was it wasn't funny at all. It was only funny to me and my partner Malcolm, my partner in crime at the time, Malcolm. But you took that and you kind of rewrote it as the legendary rock biographer Mick would have written a story. And I thought that was wonderful, but then I thought that's not the sort of thing we would put in the book that we were going to hopefully intend to appeal to anybody. So that's more of a sort of a fans thing, isn't it? And there are more lists in the book. There is unedited transcripts of some of our conversations, again, which fed into the book itself, but I think it might be nice for people to see the unedited transcripts. And then we did a kind of wrapping up conversation, didn't we? So the book was finished and locked and closed, and then you and I had another conversation about the process of, so it became very meta at that point, didn't it? About the process of writing the book. So that's also in the supplementary material. And also unique to the supplementary book is there's a whole series of colour photos. The photos in the book are black and white, but there's a whole series of colour photos. And again, I think one thing I was conscious about is if I'm going to do a book, let's not tell people all the stuff they already know. They can glean all that from the records and the interviews, and there has been some other books written. I haven't read any of them, but I imagine that a lot of that stuff is already there, you know. The facts and figures and an analysis of the songs and the albums. So it's picking stuff from my family archive photos that people will never have seen.
Yeah, I love the photos. I don't know if you've had a chance to see. I didn't see them myself until obviously when everything was done. They're fantastic. I mean, having done so many books myself, and you get these colour plate sections, which are very nice, but pretty much what you'd expect, you know. But these are all personal from your collection, and they are fantastic.
I mean, I think, you know, we live in a world now where any artist, you can go online and you can Google and you can find thousands and thousands of pictures of them on stage striking poses. So why put one of those in your book, you know? There's a million pictures of me on stage looking, you know, like a rock star or whatever, or trying to look like a rock star. So why put one of those in my book? So instead I went the complete opposite. I choose the embarrassing photos of me in the back garden with my best mate with my first Woolworths guitar,
Fantastic.
you know. And I think that's what I'd want to see, you know. So that there's a lot more of those in the supplemental book, and there's also the kind of audio equivalent of that is also in the supplemental. There's a CD which is painful for me to listen to, but the idea is that you almost get audio illustrations. So you have the pictorial illustrations, but you'll have the audio illustrations. So when I'm talking about my first heavy metal band I formed at the age of 12 at school and our first gig, you get a little brief extract actually on recording of that gig. And it's like, okay, musically this is worthless junk, I know, but it kind of, oh yeah, I'm reading about it. Oh yeah, and that's what it sounded like. So you're almost like a fly on the wall at that first ever gig of my metal band Paradox, and you're a fly on the wall at my first ever gig with my band Karma, and all this stuff. So when you're reading about it, you get this little sort of audio version of the text to kind of just put you there in that room at that moment, and that's very unique. I think I've never come across another music biography where you almost get a as well as the sort of C figure 3, you get the C audio illustration 5. You know, you can hear a little bit of what I'm talking about. So I think that's quite different as well.